Bible is full of stories that we all know and love. But how well do we know them? The answer might surprise you. The Bible you thought you knew is going to dive deep into the exquisite details of the biblical stories that make them fascinating and transforming. In our last podcast, we were working through the Joseph story as it is narrated in Genesis chapters 37 through 50. This is part 4. In last week's episode, Joseph had just been thrown into prison because he had been set up by the wife of Potiphar, the Egyptian official who had purchased him as a slave. The woman had falsely claimed that Joseph tried to rape her. Once again, God was with Joseph in prison. Whatever else that means, it meant at least that Joseph made an impression on the warden, thus eventuating in the warden's appointing him to be a custodian. Because God was with Joseph, he was quite successful in this new job. That's in verse 23 of chapter 39 of the book of Genesis. In time, 2 new prisoners were added, namely a butler and a baker who served none other than the Pharaoh himself. Somehow they had gotten themselves in trouble with the Egyptian king. In any case, they ended up in the part of the prison where Joseph was. That's in verses 1 through 3 of chapter 40. Of course, as a custodian, Joseph had access to these new prisoners. After they had been there for a while, these 2 men had dreams. These dreams were apparently disturbing, something that was indicated on their downcast faces. Ever alert, Joseph asked the 2 men what was wrong. They responded by pointing out that they had no idea what the dreams meant. At that point, Joseph offered his services. He noted that interpretations of dreams belonged to God. Without missing a beat, he went on to invite the men to tell him their dreams, which he would readily interpret. Obviously, Joseph had no difficulty in thinking that he was a conduit for divine interpretation of dreams. That's in verse 8. The butler went first. In his dream, he saw a grapevine that had 3 branches. Almost immediately, buds sprouted on the branches, and then just as fast became ripened grapes. Since the Pharaoh's cup was in the butler's hand, he pressed the grapes into the cup, evidently it became wine, and gave the cup to the king. That's in verses 9 to 11 of chapter 40. That is all Joseph had to hear. He already knew the interpretation. According to Joseph, the 3 branches represent 3 days. It is also an omen. In just 3 days, the butler will have his old job back and be able to place a cup into the Pharaoh's hand. The butler was about to get a reprieve if Joseph was correct. All that Joseph wanted in return was for the restored butler to bring up his case to the Pharaoh, since he had been sold into slavery for no good reason and had been subsequently imprisoned on trumped-up charges. That's in verses 12 through 15 of chapter 40. The baker was next. He was encouraged by what he thought was a favorable interpretation on Joseph's part. That's in verse 16. In the baker's dream, there were 3 cake baskets on his head. In the top basket, there were all sorts of baked goods for the Pharaoh. However, birds were eating out of this basket. That's in verse 17. That is all Joseph needed to know. He went right to his interpretation. The 3 baskets were temporal markers. The baskets represented 3 days. Unfortunately for the baker, in 3 days, instead of being reinstated to his previous job, he would be hanged by the Pharaoh. The birds were an ominous sign. They would not be eating baked goods, as in the dream, but would be picking the flesh off the hanged man's corpse. That's in verses 18 and 19. The birds are apparently buzzards. 3 days later happened to be Pharaoh's birthday, which of course required a party. During this gala, the Pharaoh saw to it that his butler got his old job back. Once again, the butler had the privilege of handing a cup to the Pharaoh. Joseph had been absolutely right about the dream that the butler had had in prison. While this was good news for the butler, it was not good news for the baker. Sure enough, just as Joseph had said, the baker was hanged. Obviously, Joseph had shown uncommon skill in interpreting these two dreams. For Joseph, that was good news indeed. The bad news was that the butler did not mention Joseph or his case to the Pharaoh. In fact, he forgot about the man who had interpreted his dream. That's in verses 20 through 23. Joseph would continue to languish in prison. 2 years passed while Joseph remained in jail. Then Pharaoh himself had a dream. In this dream, the king was standing beside the Nile River. Out of the river 7 cows emerged. They were sleek and fat. They proceeded to eat the reed grass on the side of the river. Just then 7 other cows appeared. These animals, however, were gaunt and thin. They stood by the other cows, but did not graze. Absurdly, however, the emaciated cows ate the fat cows. At that point, the Pharaoh awoke. That's in verses 1 through 4 of chapter 41. The next time he fell asleep, the Pharaoh had another dream. In this dream, there were 7 ears of grain, plump and good, growing on one stalk. As the dream progressed, there were 7 other ears of grain, but these were thin and blighted by the east wind. The next thing you know, incongruously, the 7 skinny ears of grain gobbled up the plump ears of grain. Then the Pharaoh woke up. That's in verses 5 through 7 of chapter 41. Being discomfited by these 2 strange dreams, the Pharaoh summoned members of his staff who were supposed to be able to interpret dreams. These included magicians and sages, but none of them had a good interpretation to offer. That's in verse 8. At that point, the butler, who had been in prison and subsequently restored to his previous position, remembered what had happened to him when he had dreams in prison and how accurately Joseph had interpreted them. The butler related his experience to the Pharaoh, which included, obviously, how uncannily able Joseph had been able with not only with his own dream, but with the baker's dream. When the butler told his story, he referred to Joseph as, quote-unquote, a young Hebrew. That's in verses 9 through 13 of chapter 41. That is all the Pharaoh needed to hear. He demanded that Joseph be summoned. Joseph had the opportunity to shave and change his clothes, after which he was ushered into Pharaoh's presence. That's in verse 14. The Pharaoh remarked that he had dreamed that no one was able to offer an acceptable interpretation, and that he heard that Joseph was good at this sort of thing. That's in verse 15. Joseph modestly took no credit. Instead, he credited God. That same God, Joseph insisted, would give the Pharaoh a good interpretation. That's in verse 16. This explanation was good enough for the Egyptian king, who continued the conversation by telling Joseph the two dreams. The Pharaoh even mentioned that no one on his staff had any idea about what the dreams meant. That's in verses 17 through 24. Without hesitation, Joseph offered an interpretation. First off, he noted that the two dreams were in reality only a single dream. Secondly, Joseph suggested that the dream was revelatory. God was using these two dreams to let the Pharaoh know what the deity is about to do. Thirdly, as was the case with the dreams that the butler and baker had had in prison, temporal markers were part of the dreams. In the case of the Pharaoh's dream, the 7 fat cows and the 7 good ears of grain represent 7 years. Joseph reiterated that the two dreams were in fact a single dream in terms of significance. Likewise, the 7 skinny cows and the 7 blighted ears of grain also represented time, 7 years, in fact. 7 years, in fact. The fat cows and the plump ears of grain should be understood as 7 years of bounty when food production is high. Conversely, the 7 emaciated cows and the blighted grain signal 7 years of severe famine. In short, God is about to bless Egypt with 7 years of bumper crops and great agricultural production, and then to reverse course and afflict Egypt with 7 years of terrible famine. Unfortunately, the two dreams, according to Joseph, means that these plans on the part of God are fixed. This is going to happen, period, full stop. That's in verse 32 of chapter 41. But Joseph does not conclude his remarks with his interpretation of Pharaoh's dreams. He continues by suggesting that the king plan for this coming situation. He proposes that the Pharaoh select someone discreet and wise. Then the Pharaoh should elevate this person to a strategic position. Joseph is still not done. He outlines the strategy. He thinks this person should appoint overseers throughout Egypt with the purpose of gathering 20% of the goods produced during the 7 bountiful years. That produce should be stored. Then, when the famine hits, Egypt will have sufficient reserves to withstand the difficulties that the land will experience when food becomes scarce. That's in verses 33 through 36 of chapter 41. If Joseph's plan is followed, Egypt will not only survive, but potentially thrive. The Pharaoh was impressed with what Joseph said. The king went on to ask his aides whether such a person was available. From Pharaoh's perspective, such a man would surely have the Spirit of God. That's in verses 37 through 38 of chapter 41. Then it dawns on the king that Joseph is clearly the man who should be appointed. After all, Joseph knew what the dreams meant and what God was about to do. It stands to reason that he will be qualified to deal with the pending situation. On the spot, the Pharaoh made the appointment. In fact, the king made Joseph second in command in Egypt. In terms of rank, only the Pharaoh would have a higher rank. The king put his own signet ring on Joseph's finger, outfitted him with royal clothing, gifted him with a golden chain, and had him ride in the second chariot, obviously right behind the Pharaoh. He would receive Egyptian accolades. The Pharaoh also ensured that Joseph got all the authority and respect that he would need for this job. Joseph was also given a proper Egyptian name and was married to Asenath, the daughter of Potiphar, who was a priest of On. Joseph went right to work. That's in verses 39 through 45 of chapter 41. At the time, Joseph was 30 years old, and he did exactly what he told the Pharaoh what needed to be done. During the years of plenty, he gathered and stored copious amounts of food. The harvests were incredible. In the meantime, Joseph's family grew. Asenath bore him 2 children, Manasseh and Ephraim. The name of the older son signaled that Joseph was able to forget all the hardships he had to endure on the way to the top. The name of the younger son reflected on the fact that God had made him fruitful in a land where he had been afflicted. That's in verses 46 through 52 of chapter 41. Joseph not only made it possible for Egypt to withstand the effects of the famine. Since he had gathered so many foodstuffs, Egypt had a corner on food. Everyone else was suffering from the devastating famine. Everyone else had to go to Egypt to buy food. In this process, Egypt was enriching itself. This was all because of Joseph. He had been a slave in Potiphar's household and then found himself in prison. Now he is second in command in all Egypt. That's in verses 53 to 57 of chapter 41. But the story does not end here. We will soon learn that his family had to deal with this awful famine. As dramatic as this story has been, it will soon be even more dramatic. Let me tell you about my plans for the mini courses. It's turning out to be a little bit more complicated than I was hoping, but this will be on the way, and I'm getting the help that I need as we speak, or as I speak now. In any case, go to my website, faspina.com. Make sure that you have an email registered there, so I have a way to contact you. If you would like for me to answer a question in a Q&A session, email me at fspina106@gmail.com. I want to thank you so very much for listening to The Bible You Thought You Knew. I have a question for you. Do you have a question or topic that you'd like me to cover on the podcast? If so, all you need to do is head over to Apple Podcasts and do 2 simple things. 1, leave a rating and review telling me what you think of the podcast. 2, in that review, ask anything you want related to the Bible. That's all you have to do. Then, listen in to hear your question answered on a future episode. Join us next time on The Bible You Thought You Knew when we discuss Jesus' personal Bible. God bless.